But thank you so much for being with us today. I am Emma from John Galt Solutions, and with me we have author Patrick Daly. Um, we're discussing today taking a relationship perspective on the supply chain, and Patrick's going to talk about some of the contents of his book, International Supply Chain Relationships, which has been published by Kogan Page, which is our partner in this series of webinars we're doing. So you can see Patrick Daly is here on the screen in the slides. He's the managing director of Alba Consulting, and that is his book that you can see there. Now, in a moment, I will get him to take it away, but I just wanted to mention that Patrick has supplied us with a poll question for you, 2 questions, in fact. You'll see them on your screen there. And he'd just like you to think about those questions during his talk. And if at any stage you have answers to these questions, or you wanted to post some comments, or if you have questions about anything else, then you'll see in your GoToWebinar interface a little chat section, a chat box, and you can type in a chat to ask questions or answer this question at any stage during the webinar, and we will have a look at them and bring them up. All right, so without further ado, thank you so much for joining John Galt Solutions and Kogan Page, and you can take it away, Patrick.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you very much, and good morning to all. I'm Patrick Daly. I'm the author of the book. I'm the author of the book International Supply Chain Relationships: Creating Competitive Advantage in a Globalized Economy. I'm the managing director of Alba Consulting, which is a supply chain consultancy based, as some of you may have already guessed from my accent, in Dublin, Ireland. So a little bit about me before we get into the substance. So far, I've had a career of approximately 30 years in manufacturing and supply chain. I trained originally as an engineer and technologist, and the first 10 of those 30 years I spent working in manufacturing. And the last 20 years in consultancy focus initially on internal logistics and manufacturing, distribution and logistics services businesses, and expanding over time to encompass more elements of the external supply chain, both on a tactical level, technical level, and on a more strategic business level. And in that time, I've been fortunate enough to work all around the world, as well as here at home in Ireland and with our neighbours in the United Kingdom across the water, also in the United States, in China, India, Puerto Rico, Uruguay, Spain, Malta, Middle East, and many other countries around the world. And many of our clients have been and are multinational corporations in sectors such as pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and FMCG, many other sectors as well, but those would be the principal ones. So this experience, together with other learning that I would have accumulated through my career in reading, traveling and studying and so on, has shaped the current worldview that I have and the perspectives that I take on the supply chain. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that today. And I won't be talking much about technical details, formulas, algorithms, or software applications, but rather how I see the supply chain at the more strategic level, its past, where it's come from, its present, and where it's likely to go to. And the reason I'm doing that is I'd like to provide some insights that I think can help to produce positive business outcomes that actually matter. And they matter in the sense that they can help to make companies and they can help to make people better off, and better off in terms of things like growth of their business, the effectiveness of what they're doing for their customers, quality, sustainability, and so on. And there'll be quite a few little examples and real life experiences in there from my work experience over the years. So this is how I see it. Over the last 40 years or so, the world of business and the supply chain has changed very, very dramatically. And in fact, I don't know what age group we have here, what demographic we have here, but the term supply chain and the concept of supply chain management was first used in public as recently as 1982, or at least 1982 is relatively recent in my thinking. And it was done by a British logistician and consultant whose name was Keith Oliver in an interview with the Financial Times. And it's not that supply chains didn't exist before then. Of course they did. I mean, just think of the grain, the silk, and the marble trade in the ancient Roman Empire. Those were supply chains. But people just didn't think about them in that way as a supply chain. And that was the case more or less up until about the 1970s. And until that time, companies, firms generally exercise control and integration over what we consider today as a supply chain through ownership. So in fact, they were vertically integrated. So they essentially owned all or most of the components of the supply chain that they needed to do business. And an extreme example of that might be the Ford Motor Company back in the 1920s. So not only did they own the factories to make the cars, they actually owned the rubber plantations. You get the rubber for the tires. They owned the iron ore mines to extract the ore to make the steel, to make the panels for the cars. And they owned the smelters, the factories, and even the showrooms where the cars were sold. Now, we all know companies are just not like that anymore. So transportation innovations like containerization and air freight, information communications technology advances, and the deregulation of finance and trade on a global level has enabled companies to focus more and more on what they consider to be their core competences and capabilities. And that's allowed them to expand their businesses both at home and abroad, and to seek new competitive sources of supply of materials and services from all around the world. So the consequence is the world we live in today. This consumer world that we're accustomed to gives us myriad choice in products and services. It's very competitive, and that's very positive. On the other side, it gives rise to many, many challenges. The supply chains that make all that possible are fragmented and they're dispersed, and often across international boundaries. And this makes them very, very complex because there are myriad players. There are many, many different players interacting with each other. You have suppliers and service providers, carriers, brokers, agents, distributors, customers, and so on. And then not only that, on top of that, you have the regulatory authorities that you need to deal with. You have government and tax authorities, you have NGOs, the press, public opinion, and so on. And then, furthermore, these things are not static, but they're changing continually over time. But companies still need to exercise integration and control, just as they did in the old days, to compete and to thrive. But they can't do it through ownership anymore. So how do they do it? Well, the best of them, and my best clients, the way they do it is through leveraging the quality of the relationships with the supply chain partners that matter most to their business. Now, if you think about it, that's quite a complex task. So to do it effectively, you need some way to characterize these relationships and some way to qualify them. And that way, you can devise strategies and tactics to leverage them to best effect, and to help to make decisions about where to dedicate your effort in terms of integration and control. And also to decide what are the governance elements that set and enforce the rules of the game of integration and control. So who is in charge of that? And it also informs how to manage risk and uncertainty in the supply chain. So over time, as I have thought about this, and in the process of writing the book that you see there on the holding slide, I came up with a number of dimensions, 3 dimensions of supply chain relationships that I find useful to help businesses and my clients and myself to categorize and qualify supply chains. And these three dimensions are as follows, and this is really important. So if you want to note anything of anything that I'm saying, it's probably these three dimensions. One is the time dimension, two is the complexity dimension, and three is the power dimension. We're going to explore those dimensions a little bit first, and then think about the interplay between them and what that means. So if you think of the time dimension, some supply chain relationships are very short in duration, and some are much longer, and some are recurring with gaps in between. So, for example, a short relationship that I consider nonetheless a supply chain relationship might be specific projects that are required to deliver, very well-defined outcomes, such as an IT implementation or the building of some sort of infrastructure. A recent project like that I worked on was to implement an automated storage retrieval system for books in a university library. So that's characterized by very intense interaction of multidisciplinary teams, quite short term. So these relationships might be measured in months more than years, 3 months, 18 months, something like that. They're quite discreet in the sense that when it's done and it's over. Nonetheless, they can be quite complex. There are lots of players. So in this particular project, there was the client, the architects, the builders, the project managers, equipment vendors, IT vendors, the logistics consultant, which was me, and the people came from various countries and were working from various different geographical locations here in Ireland, in the UK, and in the US. So it was very intense, but in many ways it was quite superficial. Withstanding the fact that the success was quite critical for the client, but you manage this type of relationship in a very different way than you would some of the relationships that are much longer. So if you think about a long-term supply chain relationship, an example from my experience. Many manufacturing clients that I have supply chain relationships with their logistics service providers that have been in place for many years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, even longer. And these tend to deepen over time. The relationship tends to deepen. And each partner becomes ever more critical to the other's success and competitiveness. One specific example is a pharmaceutical manufacturer that's a client of ours. And a logistics service provider that they work with for inbound and outbound logistics, warehousing, and so on, that support their manufacturing operations. So they would handle their raw materials, their packaging, their work in progress, and their finished product moving in and out of the plants. And that relationship started maybe 15 years ago with very simple warehouse and storage service and a little bit of transport. And it deepened over time as the logistics service provider, began to do more value-added activities such as sampling, quality inspection, call-offs for manufacturing, labeling, localization, and so on. And over time, the relationship developed to a degree that they actually make mutual investments or joint investments to improve mutual business outcomes. And I actually worked on a project on behalf of the manufacturer, but within the facility of the logistics service provider to help them to improve their productivity. It was paid for by the manufacturer, and the benefits accrued to both parties. And that was quite an interesting manifestation of what can happen in a long-term business relationship, supply chain relationship. The next dimension then is number 2, which is the complexity dimension. So there's a nice seg here, I guess, to a particular relationship that has become more complex over time, which is the relationship I just described with the manufacturer and the logistics service provider. And by complexity, I'm talking about the frequency of interaction and the number of levels that the interaction takes place on. So if you could visualize this particular relationship, there was very frequent interaction between people in the two businesses, multiple times per day. And the interaction was taking place on different levels. So you would have operatives on the service provider side interacting with operatives on the manufacturer side. Interaction also between supervisors, between account managers, and even between directors of the company. In this case, it was quite localized. So this happened geographically on one production site and one off-site location, about 30 miles apart. There are examples out there that are much, much more complex. I have another client in the automotive sector. They have maybe 50 plus production plants in 15 countries around the world. They supply the large branded motor manufacturers, people like Volkswagen and Toyota and so on. In some cases as a tier one, some cases as a tier two supplier. Their suppliers are worldwide. So not only is it frequent, not only is it multi-level, it's also happening over geographic distance. And it's not just logistics, there's also R&D involved, there's quality interaction, there are joint investments. So it's daily, multiple, multi-level, and you have the additional complexity of distance, time zones, culture, and language. Then you can think on the simpler end of the complexity dimension, you have relationships that might be quite transactional, single level, and they may be long or short duration. So an example of that might be with a supplier of some sort of a commodity or consumable product. That's not mission critical to the business. The next dimension then is very interesting, and it's one that's often overlooked, and it's the power dimension. Sometimes, if you think about it, the power distribution in the supply chain relationship is very asymmetrical in the sense that one partner is either much larger or maybe more essential to the other partner than vice versa. For example, I have a client that produces fruit and packs fruit for sale to wholesale large retail multiples, but then they also buy fruit from suppliers overseas, all over the world, places like Poland, Chile, Mexico, and so on. The fruit that we can't grow here in Ireland. So the problem with this business is that they're actually at the wrong end of asymmetrical power relationships in both their inbound and their outbound supply chain. And some of the examples of how this plays out and the challenges it produces for them are that on the inbound side, one of the greatest challenges that it impacts operational efficiency is standardization in the formats of incoming products from suppliers in terms of pack type, sizes, quantities, and so on. And that impacts greatly transport costs, warehousing, materials handling, and so on. But they have very limited influence over their suppliers to push for more standardization because they're more desperate for the supply of the product. And they're relatively unimportant as a customer to many of their international suppliers. Then on the other side of their business, the people they supply to, their customers, are large-scale multiple retailers like Tesco, for example. So they're under continuous price pressure. They're under continuous pressure to provide responsiveness in terms of service, quality, compliance, and so on. And that's a case of a very asymmetrical supply chain power relationship. Other cases are much more equal, and the relative dependency is more evenly spread. Sometimes that's because the companies are of an equal size, but it's not always to do with size. So, for example, in the pharma example earlier, the manufacturing plant is actually very dependent on the SME, logistics service provider, even though the manufacturer is part of a global organization that's multiple times the size of the logistics service provider. And this power relationship is extremely important because it governs things such as who makes and enforces the rules of the game in the particular supply chain. What's the governance structure going to be, and who is going to appropriate the lion's share of the value that's created in the supply chain. But I guess things are not quite so straightforward. So even for those who theoretically control the governance of the supply chain, exercising that governance requires time, it requires attention, and it requires resource, not to mention clarity of purpose. So if you think about the three dimensions, and if you situate each of your supply chain relationships as a function of those three dimensions, you'll end up with a spectrum of relationships that are characterized and qualified by those three dimensions. And that's quite complex in itself and very challenging to manage. So just yesterday, I met with the director of global supply chain operations at a major multinational food manufacturer with production plants here in Ireland, as well as in North and South America and Asia, actually one of the largest food companies in the world. And the challenge they have, notwithstanding their position of power and size in the supply chain, and the fact that they are on the good end of asymmetrical relationships in most cases, is the challenge of coping with the demands of the governance and control of that supply chain. They have finite resources, as we all do. They have finite skills and finite time. And the interaction of these myriad relationships and where they fit on the three dimensions of time, complexity, and power give rise to a very broad spectrum. So each relationship is unique, and each spectrum or profile that a business has is unique at any one time, and is also changing over time. But not only are the relationships complex in themselves, the overall spectrum is quite complex. So the challenges of management, of control, of resource allocation and prioritization, it doesn't really matter if you're Walmart, Toyota or Nestle with global operations, or you're an SME in upstate New York or Quebec or Tijuana. It's challenging nonetheless. So what you need to do, and what my three dimensions can help you to do when you characterize and qualify all your different supply chain relations as a function of those three scales, if you like, is it enables you to begin to triage those relationships. Questions arise that you need to deal with. So some of the questions that you might think of are, which of these relationships are most critical for the success and competitiveness of my business? Which relationships are currently in better shape or worse shape right now? Are there relationships that I'm maintaining that I don't need? Are there relationships I need that I don't have? Are there relationships that need strengthening and more attention? Are there ones that warrant less? And what is the risk to my business if certain relationships go sour or break down? And where do I need to focus my management and governance efforts? And what kind of things do I need to be doing with the different relationships? And I guess after all of that, where can I get a stiff drink to calm my nerves? So the three dimensions, if you like, gives us a means first to characterize and then to qualify the full range of supply chain relationships. And once we've done that, to triage them into three broad groups. And these three groups, first group would be those relationships that are absolutely mission critical for your business, whose loss or deterioration would cause severe harm. The second group would be those that are important enablers of your business activities, but without being mission critical. And the third group is basically the rest. And then once you've established that, you've got some way of getting your head around how you're going to manage this. And as a function of your resources, your capabilities, and your priorities, you can develop strategies and actions regarding those supply chain relationships in terms of the communications and interactions that are appropriate, how you're going to measure the performance and how you're going to drive your continuous improvement efforts, what commercial approach you're going to take to contract renewals and price negotiations, and of course you're going to be able to prioritize the deployment of your finite time, resources and effort. So I guess then to summarize what we said, Supply chains and the relationships that bind them together are complex and challenging for all types of businesses, big and small, doesn't matter who you are. There are three dimensions of time, complexity, and power that you can use to characterize and qualify the myriad relationships that you all have. And then that helps you to triage into three groups: the mission critical relationships, the enabling relationships that are not mission critical, and then the others. And then you can devise your strategies and tactics to manage and allocate your resources. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. I'm delighted to take any questions at this point that people might have.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for that very interesting discussion. Does anyone at this point have questions? I know we have a lot of people in attendance today, but you're all very quiet. Yeah, there's a lot of food for thought there. And this was just the second Kogan Page webinar that we've been doing, but there are many more to come. And you can, of course, go to the Kogan Page site to have a look at Patrick's book and many more interesting books on supply chain. With webinars, Got Solutions hopes to just, broaden questions and discussions around various topics. So of general interest to S&OP people out there. Feel free to send us any questions if you think of any afterwards. But I'd like to again thank Patrick and his insights. And
just one thing, Emma, if I may.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I'd like to invite people to take a look at the answers they gave to the two-part poll question that I put out at the beginning, and maybe take some time over the next day or two to think about your replies to those questions and what the talk today, what effect it has on the way you think about those challenges and those opportunities that you've already identified, and how do they fit into that spectrum that we spoke about. And if people want to email their thoughts and their questions and their queries on those points to me that we've spoken about today, I promise I'll answer everybody who emails me with some of my feedback and comments within 24 hours. And people can find out more about me and contact me with any question or query on any topic related to supply chain and logistics. My website is albalogistics.com, and my email is pdaly, which is PDALY @albalogistics.com. Thank you very much.
For joining us. Stay tuned for the next Kogan Page webinar series. The date will be announced very soon. Thanks so much, everybody. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Emma. Thanks very much.